Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Coffee Roasters Wrap powered by Greensquare. So I'm just finishing up editing here, guys, on the latest guest episode where I had the opportunity to talk to David Train from Ally Coffee. I've known David for years. He's worked in a bunch of different roles of coffee trading in different roasteries, and he's an amazing resource. So I was really excited to get him on and to actually use some perspective from the role he has at Ally, where he's actually the Asia Pacific manager. So he's working on a lot of different countries and talking to lots of different roasters in those different markets about buying, planning, and managing their green coffee. So I've got some notes here. We touched on like defaults. What does a default at origin mean? So a default on a contract, which is super insightful. We talk about inventory insights, so the reduction of spot coffee here in Australia, but also the reduction of actual certified stocks around the world and the timeline that this is going to impact our market for. We also talk about an offer that's too good to be true. So we've heard, and I've particularly heard some offers coming out from some different traders that are potentially newer traders in the market that seem too good to be true towards the end of 2024. And that's really an important part to understand as a roaster, that if the deal's too good to be true, you might be signing up to something that will not be sustainable. So that's a really interesting listen there to hear Dave's perspective as a trader on that. We also touch on a range of things about some of the techniques and some of the best things that you as a roaster can do. And we kind of summarize at the end of the session, like some really key steps that Dave's seeing work for roasters all across the Southeast Asia region, and I'm seeing work with a lot of the roasters we're talking to here. But that's all from me. Before we jump in and see the episode, guys, do give us a like, a share, a thumbs up, wherever you're seeing this on Spotify or YouTube. It does really help us. Or share this with anyone that you think needs to be across this or would be interested in checking it out. It does help us a lot. So guys, enjoy the app, and I'll talk to you all soon. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Coffee Roaster Wrap. This episode is an amazing guest episode, getting a little insight into buying green coffee in 2025, what's happening, what's moving around, maybe some markets that we can learn from, and just kind of touching on some important things for roasters to be aware of, and some also action points of how you can best handle yourself in this market and in this kind of new normal that we're experiencing moving forward. So I'm very lucky to have a wonderful guest today. So I'd like to introduce you all to David Train from Ally. Thanks for jumping on, mate.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Yeah, very good, dude. Thanks for making the time, man. Before we get into it, Dave, would you mind giving everyone just a bit of an intro into yourself, your role, and kind of what work you do in the industry?
As Caleb said, my name is David. I'm the key account manager for Ally Coffee for the Asia Pacific region. So broadly speaking, that's more or less anywhere in Asia and the Pacific. So, give or take 4 billion people. I've been involved in the coffee industry since 2005, and I guess more or less hospitality since about the year 2000. I've worked at McDonald's and then straight into sort of cafes. Fortunate enough to have either worked for coffee roasters or amazing cafes in England and Germany and Australia, and have been involved in the green coffee sector for maybe 6 or 7 years. I'm not entirely sure. I'm still struggling to believe it's 2025. So
I had to write the date today, mate, and I was like, hang on, what? It's 2025. It boggles me. Yeah, well, thank you, man. I think it's really nice to have you on here. So the big reason I wanted to get Dave on to have a conversation with you all, guys, is we talk about this all the time. And I'm lucky to have the opportunity to speak to Dave about this and to have these experiences and understanding of that role. Like you touched on it there, man, about your role and what it encompasses at the moment, and some of the opportunities of seeing how other roasters in maybe other countries in our region are handling the market or are buying coffee. So I think maybe as a bit of a kickoff in this guide, from your perspective, would it be able to, and this is put the universe into a teacup kind of question, but what are some of the biggest things that you've seen change and you think are going to be like new normals or new kind of mainstays as roasters when we're having to buy green coffee?
That's a tough one to answer. I think at the moment it's a little bit of a survival instinct, not just for roasters but cafes and everyone, just regular, average people outside of the industry when it comes to just economics and cost of livings, etc. So one of the things that I'm seeing more of is, I guess, like the people are more scared of supply as opposed to price. I have seen and continuously see that coffee is getting more expensive. I mean, as of today, the 29th of January, it's technically, excluding inflation, the highest it's ever been. And I think that information is fairly well shared around the world. So I think the hardest thing now becomes supply is probably more imperative than price. Actually, physical delivery of coffee is
and I think that's something that you and me have both been talking about together, and in our channels when we talk to people about stuff is around that. I call it the quantity conversation. We have a price conversation, and there was a long time where people weren't really believing the price conversation because they're like, it'll go down. And then very quickly when those people, when the majority start to get to the price conversation, we're now realizing because of, environmental effects and the emergence of new consumer markets, from my perspective, we're putting that pressure on quantity and access to quantity. So now it's, can I get enough? Which is going to be a big challenge because all of these things have changed rapidly kind of for a buyer. So for a green coffee buyer at a roastery or a roaster kind of buying for them their needs, it may feel like an overnight change. We've probably been seeing it move in this direction for a little bit of time now, but we've seen that kind of what feels like an overnight shift from being able to call up and be like, hey dude, what do you got in the warehouse? I need a couple pallets of Brazil. And now those are getting no's instead of yeses. Are you finding that from your perspective?
I've been asked by more or less all the coffee traders that I know in Australia for coffee. They need coffee to either fulfill contracts, or they've obviously had people reaching out for spot purchases, or there's delays, which always happens in terms of the green world. So and I've had to just turn to people and say, look, unfortunately, I don't have
excess
a long position, and I think a lot of importers in general now are running very tight books and very tight positions. Purchasing more on a need basis as opposed to having large spot positions, and that obviously creates a few issues in the Australian market when people, as you said, have been so used to just going, hey, cool, what's your price on your Brazils or your Colombians? Can I get a pallet next week? Yep, cool. See you later. Those conversations no longer exist.
Yeah, I remember, and I've been kind of, from my perspective, trying to communicate that as much as we can over the last little bit about like spot coffee is at record lows in Australia, because I think that's a really important thing for Australian roasters particularly understand, but it does seem like that's kind of proliferating in other markets as well, that it's not just Australia. Like spot coffee is becoming less available around the world, but particularly from my experience in Australia, I've seen an over-reliance on that availability, and the timeline of procurement was so fluid that it wasn't really required for a roaster to know harvest cycles, to know buying time. It was, I can kind of pick when I run out or when I'm getting low because someone will have some. So it's a big shift for a lot of these roasters, and these aren't just your small, couple bags a week roasters. These are tons a week roasters who are using that mentality, and I'd seen that a lot through my consulting and time kind of working.
Yeah, of course. There's a surprisingly large amount of roasters that roast significant volumes that have historically wished to purchase only on spot rates. But that was when the market was 90 cents per pound.
Yeah, those were the days. It's crazy, but it's one of those.
I think it's just to sort of reiterate what you were saying in terms of spot purchasing. It comes also down to like global supply, and then like certified warehouses and stock levels are actually also at a low. So obviously there's still coffee being produced and exported, but the physical deliveries and inventory are at super low amounts, which is also one of the reasons why there's a peak in the market in terms of price. So it's whether or not, let's say you're a huge commercial buyer that wants to just draw down on a futures contract of delivery, that coffee might not actually exist. And that is removed from the specialty world in terms of that aspect. So it's the actual physical supply of coffee, even for the largest of the largest, is a challenge.
Yeah, I think another important thing is like with that physical supply challenges, like it's real. It's not just a, it's not a, and I don't think it's an easy thing to correct. We don't like, we're going to need multiple very good harvest to correct that position. So that gives me a perspective of longevity of kind of volatility on a supply space. So even if we turned around and Brazil smashed it out next year and we had a great harvest, which isn't looking likely from what we're hearing, even if that did happen, that's not going to, it's going to take multiple years of this. Like I think we're on track for the 5th year of a deficit out of Brazil. This is actually, from my understanding, it's a biannual crop in Brazil, and this is the down year as well, which is putting more pressure on at this time. So it's important to understand for everyone listening that these things don't, it's not like the market where it might drop by, we have a 5% up and down in a day. The inventory levels will take a lot longer to be restored. So that's going to be an ongoing impact, I think.
It's also that a lot of those certified warehouses or, ungraded stocks, they hold positions for sort of 3 years because the coffee they're taking is really not necessarily, like, it's still graded and needs to pass a certain quality, but it's not necessarily there for its intrinsic cup quality. So if you're thinking of coffee that's 3 years old and even that is no longer existing and needs to be replaced. So if, even as you said, there's a bumper harvest coming and it's a year and year and year and year replacement, like, there's probably not going to see an ease in supply chain, physical supply of coffee for the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So I think we touched on it there. It's like, obviously supply is a big part of that. I think it's interesting to understand as well. And I know you and me have discussed this together, and it was really informative for myself to understand when we talk about in a market like this, the risk of a default at origin on a contract and what that actually, how that functionally can affect, but also what does that intrinsically mean? And I know you've explained it to me multiple times, but I know you can explain it a lot better than I can. So would you mind kind of talking through what that exactly is of an origin default and how that would affect through?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the easy things for people to remember was probably through peak COVID, when the coffee market more or less went from 90 cents to sort of 150 cents per pound, and Colombian contracts almost instantly were just null and void. They were just torn up.
So just to clarify, when you say Colombian contract, is that a contract between a roaster and their importer, or is that an importer and their, like, where do you see those contracts?
Importer and exporter and producer, or co-op, exporter, or whomever the coffee is being. So
it's on that end of the supply chain. It's not the contract that a roaster, signs with an ally or someone like that. No. It's the actual export producer side of it.
Yeah. So if you take that as an example, so historically you used to be able to purchase futures contracts or prices in Colombia for 3 years ahead. And if you take that currently, I can't get a price for a shipment further than 3 months ahead right now. So coffee to ship in the next 3 months, I can price you. But if you want coffee to ship in June of this year, no one in Colombia is going to give you a price because of the risk of default. And what that was, you lock in a contract with someone in January of this year for delivery or shipment to start in November of this year. So that's, give or take 10 months from now. Yeah. If the market is 357, I think it is today, and the market goes to 450, that producer or co-op or whomever that has the physical coffee, they can decide not to deliver because they want to renegotiate, because they want 100 cents per pound extra, which, for better or worse, it's a hard thing to sort of say. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's, if you're going to give me more money to do less work, of course I would say yes. So the risk of default is you agree a contract right now for a delivery or a shipment to happen in the future, and there will be defaults. And there are, unfortunately, loads of companies, either publicly or not publicly, that are owed lots of coffee, and who they supply, whether that's importers or roasters, potentially are not going to get that coffee, and will then therefore need to purchase that coffee at the spot rate, which is going to be significantly higher.
So I think that's a really nice way that you've been able to kind of just show the example of like the risk of a default contract, also why they happen as well. And obviously in this volatile market, like if we looked, like you gave the example of what it could be at the end of this year, but if we looked at the start of, last year to the end of last year, that rapid rise, the commitment in those contracts puts a lot of pressure on actually servicing those when they could be worth a lot more at that time, or there could be a lot more value in that product at that time. So I can understand that's innate risk. Is there any way that you would say a roaster can protect or prepare for any scenario like that from your perspective or experience, Matt?
Oh, that's I don't think it can be prepared for a default. It's not really on an importing side a good thing. What I think you can do, obviously, is look at if it's a country like Brazil, instead of a 1, 2, or 3 year contract, probably trying to look at 6 month contract, because that's a more realistic expectation of what would be delivered. Also, by the time coffee is approved, booking confirmations, shipping instructions, etc., all confirmed, by the time it gets to you, it's probably going to be 6 months away anyway.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to that, you're probably a little bit more safer when it comes to origins that have only got one harvest per year. Your Costa Ricas, your Central Americans, your Ethiopias, because they are not looking to hold coffee. They are looking to get it going as fast as possible.
There's a very clearly drawn timeline of when they're trying to move a product, where potentially other countries that have continual crops, there's more risk of them, holding back and waiting to the next buy or sell or where the market moves kind of thing.
Exactly. So even though Brazil has historically only one harvest, they're shipping coffee all year. A lot of the farms there have their own mills, their own factories, their own warehouses. They can physically hold the actual coffee itself, whilst a lot of other origins, the farms or the co-ops, etc., are obviously significantly smaller, and they don't have the physical infrastructure to hold the coffee. And as we know, doesn't necessarily get better with age if you don't have particularly good drying and storing conditions. So they need to get it going as fast as possible.
So in light of that kind of understanding, we've talked about supply, we've talked about the risk of what a default contract can look like, and why, we're probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're sitting at a time where these things are a much higher chance of these in this type of market. Is it also you might hear it yourself, but I've heard a lot of roasters who someone's offered me this. It sounds too good to be true. And I think there's a lot of, towards the end of last year particularly, there was a lot of roasters in Australia who were I was finding of suppliers that I've never heard of. Someone being this company's offered me a container of Brazil at this price. What do you reckon? And I'm well, I've never heard of them, and that's a bad start. I've been in the industry for 15 years, and if I haven't heard of them, that's a bad start. From your perspective, have you heard of things like this happening? And is there any advice to a roaster who has a deal that sounds too good to be true?
Yeah, I've heard of it a lot, and not just the last year, but there's always some sort of import or operation or something that pops up that has coffee at a price that is usually too good to be true. And unfortunately, in those situations, I've heard of people either firstly not getting what was delivered. Fortunately, most importers in Australia don't operate on a prepaid system, so it's not like you're going to prepay for a container and then it ships. It's usually once it arrives. So but if you're banking on having obviously a significant amount of coffee once it arrives, if it isn't what you thought it was, sometimes it comes and it's meant to be a grade 1 Ethiopian, and it's filled with sticks and stones. And so I think it's one of those things that when you're looking at purchasing coffee, not to discourage any new importer or new exporting company from operations, but it's probably do your due diligence on who they are, how they operate, where they source from, who's financing them, where are they getting the capital to operate. It could be their family's farm, it could be and for whatever reason they're wanting to distribute coffee into Australia. I think it's definitely usually, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. Or if it's too good to be true, what is wrong with the coffee that makes it, such an attractive purchasing price?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think it's important to understand, like you said, understanding that like kind of you have to do a bit of homework as a roaster. You can't just take the first deal because, like you said, it might not be a financial loss in the you putting down a deposit. That's not really a thing in Australia. So if they're asking that, that's very different. But it's more about the sense that you're not actually securing the product in the timeline you need, and you're relying on this company or this avenue to be your supply. And if that supply doesn't arrive or doesn't meet the standard when it does arrive, what is your defensive moat to be able to plan for that? Because there isn't spot coffee to then go grab some or pull some from around the corner. So I think it's a really important thing because I feel like I'm hearing it more at the moment, and it's concerning because a lot of roasters are going, well, that means literally the conversation I had the other day was, well, but if I get this, I don't have to put my price up to my customers. And I was like, that is really dangerous mentality to have. And I understand it because, no one wants to put their price up to a customer, but at the end of the day, like that's putting you directly in the risk as a roaster of having that conversation. If we're not willing to effectively price our products and pass price on to our customers, you're going to get in a conversation where you're not going to be able to give them product. And they're going to be like, hey, I need 50 kilos this week. And you go, I can send you 20.
Or what you end up having to substitute the coffee with is
It's
potentially
far lower.
a different grade, a different origin, different process. It is a dangerous situation. I had conversations at the beginning of COVID with roasters about obviously looking at incremental pricing changes because, at the time people had locked in contracts at really good value, and I could have bought the coffee back from them and resold it and generated more revenue for the company. But it was one of those conversations where they were happy to ride out for the next, 12 to 18 months. But the foresight was, prices are going to most likely change. And if you go from 90 cents per pound up into, I think around a year and a half ago, it was about 200 cents off the top of my head. And when you need to recontract that coffee, it's never going to be the same price again. And if you haven't had that conversation with your client base about the cost increase, if it was only $1 per kilo at the time roasted, but all of a sudden you're like, actually, I need to charge you $3 or $4. It's a lot harder for them to take than it was slow increments of change. So yeah, it's a scary prospect.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge I've seen with roasters, and a lot of the roasters that we're speaking to in Australia at the moment is the conversation hasn't been had for so many years that it's compounded the pressure on having that conversation and the increment that has to happen. If it was a standard like a CPI, and that's not the reality of it, but if it was like every year we go up by 5% in our prices because that's the nature of it, the market hasn't moved like that. So the market hasn't forced these conversations to be had. So the stability of that has actually put us into this position now that it's not stable, and now that there has been these significant jumps where, I think last year it was almost like 70% in the year. We're going to have those conversations, and it's going to feel quite dramatic, and potentially a lot of the roaster offerings, especially in the wholesale. I think that's the clearest part that we see people having challenge in. Retail seems to be a little bit more adaptive. There is still some challenges there, but in the wholesale market, the price of a kilo of coffee, particularly in Australia, had been substituted and weighted with so much else service. So it was X amount per kilo plus a machine, plus a banner, plus a training, plus an umbrella. And what's happening now is we're eroding all of those things away.
Yeah,
so
thankfully.
Now it's 100%. Like I literally did a video with a mutual friend of ours. I think Bora, who's from Honor Coffee. We did a video years ago, man. And it was I was like, free on loans dead. And it was literally the first month of COVID. I was like, free on loans dead, figure out something else to do. I have to find it and see if I can link it. But it was one of those ones.
So
it's
Australia, the pricing mechanisms that we've had in place for the quality that we have and the price at which we charge per cup is backwards.
It's been hyper competitive. Like we've had a hyper competitive pricing and offering model in that wholesale market, which has been like the reason we've been able to do that as a market. And we've all been part of it. We've worked for those companies, and like we've all built our industry on that. And that's the challenge that we have to come back from now. But is we've allowed a low coffee price to inflate our ability to kind of add those extras in there. And now that coffee's moving in a spot, everyone, we're talking about the market being high. For me, coming out of this from a personal perspective, I think the higher we can keep the C price, the better. We have to get better at providing value as roasters, and kind of setting ourselves up to have financial models that don't depend on an undervalued product, financial models that depend on a valued product that incentivizes the continual production and kind of growth of our.
Well, I completely agree. I think in Australia, we've done a really good job at commercializing specialty coffee.
Yeah.
Probably better than anyone in the world at making specialty coffee, a commodity or a commercial brand. We never had a point of differentiation when specialty was booming in Australia, where there was a petrol station or a fish and chip shop that was selling a cappuccino at the time for $3.50, and then when specialty started booming, everyone was too scared to charge accordingly. So like, this fish and chip shop down the road selling cappuccinos for $3.50. I've got a La Marzocco, Linear Classic.
I've invested tens of thousands of dollars in my setup, but I'm going to try and compete with them on a price.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that we never had a chance to do. Whilst in other markets, there's always been a more commercial driven purchase, and then you had your specialty option. So there's always been a better point of differentiation. So yes, you can buy a cheaper coffee, generally made from lower grade coffee. Taste is subjective, but it's questionable. Or go to a cafe that is, it's got customer service, it's got all the bells and whistles, and pay accordingly.
Yeah, and that's my maybe like optimist hope out of this. It's quite funny when we have these conversations, we have to remind each other that we're optimistic about stuff, because it's very easy when it's challenging. Like for me, I look at that and I go, this is the opportunity in the Australian market for specialty to differentiate itself and for quality to be the driver. So right now, if it comes to a spot where the fish and chip shop down the road is having to pay more for their coffee, if I have to pay $5 for a coffee everywhere, then I need it to be a good one. And it changes that conversation to value. Like where are we as roasters providing value? Where are we as cafe owners are providing value, rather than how can we get more people in at a lower price point?
I completely agree. It's for me. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing to say, but I don't go out for coffee very often. I tend to drink a lot of coffee at home. I have obviously access to quite a lot of coffee and etc. And when I'm heading out somewhere, I'm not your usual punter, so I'm happy to spend on coffee. But it's going to a cafe that, particularly, hospitality for me is imperative, having good customer service, but a point of differentiation, because in Australia you can get coffee more or less everywhere. But it is hopefully a chance that roasters and cafes and consumers can go, okay, cool. This cafe offers coffees at $7.50 for this reason. I don't necessarily like that coffee, so I'm going to go to this local fish and chip shop. Nothing against fish and chip shops, but it's and their coffee's a bit cheaper. And my old man's the same. I could give my old man arguably some of the best coffees in the world that have won, best of Panamas and competitions, etc. But he's also happy to go to 7-Eleven, and that's absolutely fine. That coffee, every coffee has a home. Every coffee needs to go somewhere. There's nothing wrong with those coffees. Some of them actually are really good value and quality. But it's a point where we can finally go, okay, my business is specialty coffee shop or specialty coffee roaster. These are the coffees that I roast and purchase. If a consumer comes in and is not happy to pay, then maybe unfortunately you might lose one customer, but you're still going to have hopefully a successful business model. And I saw that when I lived in Germany in the late, I don't know what you want to call it, the early 2010s, etc. When specialty was booming, and our coffee was double the price of at the time it was €3 for a flat white.
€3 still ends up being $5.
The price of the coffee in Australia is a different story, but it was one of those things that we were saying, our coffee costs more because of these reasons. And people would taste it, and 9 times out of 10 people were like, oh wow, this is different. Maybe good different, bad different, but and they maybe 70% of the time they come back, and the rest of the actually I prefer different style.
Yeah. Well, in a scenario like that you painted, is like it's one, the quality, the consistency, and the holistic service that comes with it. Like, where it's forcing our businesses, like as a roaster, it's no longer about what's the best offer I can do. So I've seen a lot of roasters, and I'm sure you've seen it as a trader as well. There's the inbound leads for new customers for roasters, like new cafes talking to them, has gone rampant in the last few months in Australia, because these cafes who have been trained to go, who can get me the lowest price, are now getting pushback from suppliers, and they're trying to shop around to as many as they can to find that cheapest price. The exact same thing I'm seeing happen with roasters who are used to being able to get whatever coffee they want whenever they want. And one supplier says, no, well, okay, well, I'll shop around. And we're seeing a lot more of that happening, which is challenging, but it's going to teach us and teach our market and our industry that we need to identify where we sit. And when we talked about it, when you mentioned there of like a specialty and maybe a more commodity or kind of more commonly accessible product, and differentiating them. In Australia, it's just coffee, and there's really a lack of definition. I was talking to someone. I love like trying to give like an example or like compare it to something else. But I'm like, if we look at food, we have cuisines. So I don't walk into the corner fish and chip shop and ask for some ceviche crazy, or I'm not asking for some exotic sushi, because I understand that I'm in a different type of establishment providing a different type of offering. The same that I don't walk into a sushi place and ask for, a bag of fish and chips with chicken salt. Like, it's understanding the difference in the food industry and our cuisines and the cost of those cuisines. We're having to define that very quickly in our Australian market for coffee, and to know, okay, where does this sit and why is that different to the others?
I had a friend here from Melbourne over the long weekend. And he was, he's a milk-based coffee with one sugar. And we went to a cafe that he's never been to before. And first thing he said to them was, can I get a flat white with one sugar? And I had to pull him up and said, you haven't tried this coffee. How do you know that you need the sugar? And he'd be like, oh, because it's just what I do. And I'm like, that's fine, but maybe it's the Australian viewpoint of coffee, is that they're not a coffee drinker. They're like, I'm a latte with one sugar drinker. That's mine. The amount of times I go to a party, people are like, I love coffee and I love cappuccinos with 2 sugars. And I'm like, no, you love sweet milk. I think it's one of those things that with coffee, we never had the opportunity to say flavor experience, or this tastes this way, and we're okay with that with food and alcohol. But once it comes to coffee in Australia, people just like, it's like you've insulted their mother. It's just an unfortunate circumstance of how we've built our industry.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting dynamic that we're going to go through all together, and we're all on the ride for it, and where it's happening whether we like it or not. I don't think there's the ability for anyone to kind of abstain or stand outside of this. Like, we're going to go through these challenges of like defining value while the price of a product's increasing. One thing I wanted to probably jump back to and get your experience on as well, which I think is super valuable, and this is one of my favorite things to talk to you about. In your role with Ally, you have the opportunity to obviously service, like you mentioned, what'd you say, 4 billion? Like, it's a crazy...
I don't service 4 billion people.
Technically, bro, you do. If they ask for it, you'd have to. It's the job. But like, it's quite a wide area, and there's different consumption markets. So is there some things from a particular country in Asia or somewhere else that you've kind of... are serving and working with that you think would be really insightful for Australian roasters to know, or ways that they handle green coffee procurement and management a little bit differently?
I think it's so one major issue we face in Australia is the fact that we're so far away. So Australian coffee roasters, to request a sample from origin usually would take, if you're lucky, 3 weeks. Not to mention the fact that the Australian customs and quarantines are a pain, and can really hold up shipments and stuff. So what you have in this scenario is you have a delay in getting coffees, and people want to try coffees from multiple suppliers, and that I completely understand. But what we don't realize is if you take a viewpoint of just Southeast Asia alone, there's 700 million people that live in Southeast Asia, and of that, I think it's about 70% are under the age of 40. So it's a growing young population.
Yeah. Wow.
And they have a desire for coffee. And so what you see is, whilst we're waiting here in Australia, you have these countries that are on our doorstep that get a sample usually faster because of trade routes. If you just think of literally in terms of logistics, coffees going in and out of Asia or anything going in and out of Asia, it's a lot faster than Australia.
Where the end of the line, they're a stop on the route to a lot of places.
And so what you end up having is, by the time you want to make a decision, someone comes out and decides to buy all of it and or a lot of it. And I know you and I've spoken a lot about the Luckin coffee, understanding to purchase a huge amount of coffee. So we have, and that's not even the Southeast Asian part. That's mainland China. So what you have is these neighbors of ours that have got a massive population, a massive young demographic, and specialty coffee is starting to boom. So every single time I go to a trade show, what I see there is I see all the farmers that are from these really established farms, whether they're the Colombian producers, Panamanian, Ethiopian, whomever. And more or less all of their supply has been purchased a year ahead by their Asian clientele. And so one of the major issues is, if you're waiting for coffee, or even if you get the samples, if the coffee fits your flavor profile, and I know potentially price, it's always a bit of a challenge, book it. Don't wait. Book it, because someone is going to take a significant amount more of coffee. I have been asked twice in the last 4 months by 2 different businesses for quotes. And the smallest quote was 500 containers of coffee. And these were good quality coffees, still specialty grade.
Can I ask a question? Are these Australian or Southeast Asian based
No, Southeast Asian, sorry.
Southeast Asian. I was going to say, I was like, an Australian roasted getting quotes, that's pretty...
No, I've had some Australian roasters of larger volumes wanting coffee, but not on this scale.
Yeah.
And I also went to the largest coffee roastery I've ever seen in terms of production in Malaysia.
Wow.
Roasting over 150 tons a week. So
150 tons a week, and I know it would be really hard, but could you give an estimate on their maybe SEA score would be a reference, but what do you reckon the base level of coffee that's going through there is sitting at in comparison?
So they roast everything from Panama down to your Brazilian grinders.
Okay, wow.
And so grinders are, for anyone that's not too sure, they're called grinders because they're historically pre-ground for instant coffee. The actual cup themselves, really interesting coffee and really interesting to look at.
That's a very nice way of saying it. I've only ever tried it once in my life.
A very interesting flavor profile. So that they contract roast for people. They do so.
Just the volume of that is impressive. And I think one thing you stated there is we talk about Luckin. Luckin is the franchise that's coming out of China at the moment, which is on its track to surpass Starbucks as this global leader, signing momentous agreements with Brazil to secure product and supply, which is they're doing amazing things in the rate and the speed and the way they're moving. But I think it's really easy to see that as China's growing, that market's growing. But like you said, Southeast Asia is such a multitude of different origins, and so it's kind of hard to see that perspective, but it's happening there as well on a lot of little bases where there's these growth and these little areas that are incubating and growing with massive populations consuming coffee, where in Australia we have an aging population that we're trying to retrain to value a product that are set on $1 USD per pound benchmark in their mind and an older kind of base. And we have these emerging countries that have emerging and growing younger populations that are being trained on this new start. So we have to catch up as an industry, and as roasters we need to get there.
I think I saw an article, it might have been seen yesterday, or about the rise of iced beverages in Australia. And I've always been really fascinated why Australians want to have an extra hot latte on a 35-degree day. Whilst when I'm in Southeast Asia for work, every time I order a coffee, they ask whether I would like it hot or iced.
Yeah.
Because a minimum of 50% of their beverages are made with ice. So not only that, you have a young demographic that are really interested in creative flavor profiles of whether it's exotic plots. And if you take a step back from that and look at Indonesia and Thailand as an example, in Thailand, I've been to the greatest cafe I've ever been to in my life.
Name drop. I want to know.
That's a place called Nana Coffee. It's just incredible. But if you look at Thailand and Indonesia, they're producing countries. So what they have is they have really high import tax on green coffee because they have their own consuming market. Now, what this means is the price of an Indonesian coffee is relatively high in comparison to a lot of other origins. So a country like Indonesia that has 300 million people, they're already used to paying a high level price. So when you come in and say, okay, an Ethiopian coffee might be 550 cents per pound, they're okay with that because plus they're going to pay their import tax on that, but they're already used to having a higher cost of the internal product. So it's one of those things that in Australia in particular, we haven't been exposed to having such a high price, whilst internally in these countries, which are now, starting to really grow in the specialty sector, the price conversation has not hit them as hard. Yes, their purchasing power, their economical parts of their country, it's a different story, but the actual cost of coffee. And then when you go to these cafes, I'm paying, $7 or $8 Australian dollars for a coffee. Or I can go get a copy, which is dark roasted and for $1, but it's a different price point. And then to put more emphasis on that, if you start looking at WBC, all the Brewster Championships and things like that, like who's winning the competitions, where are they from, what kind of driving force they have. And it's one of those things that whilst Australia has done obviously very well historically, and we punch pretty well for our weight.
Yourself included, mate. Yourself included there.
Never on the global stage, but we love our sport in Australia, regardless of what it is. But if you look at that, and then you've also got the World Brewers Cup happening in Jakarta, and so there's this market that we are not necessarily paying attention to. And then you also have Australian companies now operating businesses in Indonesia because they see the market growth. They see St. Ali is there, Blacklist from Perth is there. Shane McNamara moved there many years ago and has his own brand called Expat in Bali. Yeah, it's one of those things that
I remember, when Shay first went over, everyone's like, what do you do? I guess he's just going to go live on the beach. And then it was years later, I think I saw him, he was back during COVID for a little bit. And it was just man, he's it's crazy how big it is out there. They've done amazing work, but literally, like you said, those brands are moving into those markets to actually set up and sell and offer. And it's a really interesting thing that I think is important for us to understand, to break our bubble a little bit, not just look at the roaster down the road or the roaster in the next state who we're, think we're competing with. We have to understand when we're in a volatile green market like this, there is a level of competition to access a product. And if we're going to be at that base level fighting to try and get specialty as cheap as possible, we're putting ourselves at risk that we're going to be the losers in that battle very quickly. And how do we mitigate that? So I think that's going to be a big challenge. So I guess to summarize that, would you say one of the things you're noticing from your more Southeast Asian based clients outside of Australia is their procurement a little bit more, their price points are a little bit higher and they're a little bit more proactive, or would that be the wrong kind of assessment?
No,
would that be?
They are actually fairly proactive and switched on when it comes to the economics of coffee. And a lot of conversations I have, I have a medium size, it's semantics in terms of volume, but a decent sized roaster in Malaysia, he buys FOB and he'll only buy 10 ton of coffee at a time. And a shipping container can hold almost 20 ton because it's cheaper for him to purchase the coffee FOB, which FOB means it's literally just going to be put in a container at origin and nothing's going to happen to it until you process all the shipping information, booking confirmations, etc. Yeah. But he understands the economics of him purchasing only 10 tons of coffee at a time. Having it shipped directly to him in Malaysia is cheaper than having coffee sit in a warehouse, the cost of finance, etc. So you have people that understand the economics of coffee, or in terms of running a business, as opposed to the passion. I
Mm.
actually had this. I actually said this to someone yesterday about if I had started a coffee shop when I was 21, with all the love and energy I have for the industry and the desire, it probably would have, particularly back then, not succeeded. Because I wouldn't have understood the economics of running a coffee shop, etc., or a business or a roastery. And
Yeah.
so the conversations I have there probably are a little more economically savvy in terms of understanding futures months, whether it's where to fix a contract or how they wish to purchase, whilst they've never had spot coffee readily available. In Malaysia, there's probably less than I think I counted 10 coffee importers that operate there, and their population is 30 odd million. Whilst in
Yeah. Wow.
Australia, I couldn't tell you how many of us exist.
It'll be interesting to see how many exist at the end of the year. But we did see like a boom of it. So I would say there's like 30 to 50 serious players, but there was a big boom of people who would bring in a container here, a container there. But we're going to see that kind of refine as we're going to see cafes refine, roasteries. Like we're going to see consolidation in the Australian
Oh,
market, particularly.
100%. You see it in Origin. You see it in terms of larger importers being consolidated. I think we
Yeah.
are in an interesting dynamic moving forward in the world. I think
Mm.
the larger businesses have the finances and resources to ride the wave and to purchase coffee at the elevated prices and absorb it and wait,
Yeah.
and to consolidate. Whilst I think the medium-sized roasters are probably the ones that are suffering the most, because they haven't had a chance to change their pricing dynamics or their purchasing because of their cost of goods. Whilst I think still your real small boutique businesses probably are not as reliant on the pricing structure, because I have conversations with some roasters that roast 50 to 100 kilos a week. And if coffee goes from 15 AUD to a kilo to 23 AUD kilo, they're like, yeah, it's okay.
We can
I'm
make
all
it
right.
work. Yeah.
Yeah, but someone that's roasting 500 to 1500 kilos per week, it's a different story.
Yeah, it was always one of those things. It's the chasm of growth as a roaster. So like the amount it costs and takes you to get to being a ton a week roaster is just it multiplies when you try and get to 2 ton, and then from 2 to 5, and then from 5 to 10, and being caught in those spots and not right now being caught in those spots and not an optimal efficiency and kind of planning structure can be very risky and very like challenging, to be honest. So yeah, I think it's a wild time, but I think it's taking like the romance is being removed from the industry right now. Whether you're a cafe owner in like, and this is obviously from my experience, it's Australia based, but the romance is removed from a cafe owner, a roaster, and even a trader at the moment in Australia. The romance isn't left. And what's left is we find out what the business principles that are being applied in those different businesses are, and whether they're going to be robust enough or whether they're aware enough to adapt those to be able to move forward. And I think there is an opportunity there where planning can play the game really well. So like I have an example that I was speaking to two roasters, very similar timelines around September last year, about getting ready to start planning their Brazil that they're going to need. One does about just under 5 ton a week, and one does just over like 50 kilos a week. And they were both talking about it. The larger one was like, but if I book now and it drops, I could leave, 100 grand on the table.
Yeah.
And the little one was like, yeah, sweet, let's just book. Like I want to know I can get a year's worth. So like if let's get it, it's a year's worth. That conversation, the way it worked is the smaller roaster booked early, committed in the right timeline, communicated with their supplier, same supplier. The larger roaster waited and booked couple pallets, and then tried to book a big contract in December. And there was about, I think it was almost like it was around 25% difference in price between the two. And that's where it's very rare that we can see, usually volume wins in these scenarios, but that's a scenario where planning beat volume.
Yeah.
And the security that this smaller roaster has compared to the security this larger roaster has, just because of planning and actioning, allowed them to actually have a competitive advantage. This smaller roaster just roasts for themselves, but it just highlights that. And I think that's the biggest thing that I want to get through to roasters is, if you can afford it today, you get it? How long's the lease for your building? How we've got to understand that we need to have access to that product, and just because it might go down, that is way too big of a gamble, and it is literally a gamble. So yeah, from my perspective, I see there's opportunities there where planning is going to be the best way out of this for a roaster.
I think planning is literally the most important thing for any of us, because if we look at coffee as a forecast, more or less, so Central America and Ethiopia are literally in the peak of coffee right now. So we have had, from late last year, the producers or the wet mills asking us our projections for this upcoming harvest to see what they can secure, what's going to be available, what cup scores, what quality, etc.
Yeah.
That conversation starts to happen in October, November, December. These coffees won't arrive until June, July, August. And then, if you think of August to November, that's only, 3-4 months. And so what people need to understand is, essentially, as soon as your coffee starts to arrive, you need to be thinking about the planning and forecasting for next year. Because if we wait too long, let's say you really love this farmer and you really want to secure that coffee next year, if you don't have that conversation in time, that coffee's got to go. And so the planning and foresight is imperative, because it means that us as the trader, we can have that conversation and say, okay, we need 400 bags of this grade of this coffee to go to Australia for this roaster. Can we secure this for the earliest possible ship? Awesome. If we don't plan and foresight that, we're not bringing that coffee in. So it's unfortunately, if you're a roaster that's looking at just wanting to get a ton here and there, it just won't exist, because for us as traders, it doesn't make any economical sense to be able to bring that in.
It's too costly for you to take that risk of bringing that product, storing that product. Like, all the finance required there is just, it's non-viable anymore from what we're hearing. That's not from a one. Like that, guys, that is from everyone we're talking to who brings coffee into Australia. It's not viable to be holding that.
I didn't know what a margin call was until recently, and all of a sudden I know it costs millions and millions of dollars to keep these futures contracts and coffee deliveries still relative. So
it's crazy.
It's not economically, and coffee importers, I think maybe historically we'll paint it as the evil middleman, but we don't operate on very large margins. We operate on volume. So cafes historically have great margin, but it's only a $5 coffee, so it's you need to sell a lot of it. Yeah. And so that's one of those things.
I remember the rhetoric a few years back before COVID, where roasters were like, what if we just cut out our supplier? What if we just do direct to origin, direct trade, it's this, it's that? And it was one of those things that, like, to be honest, at the time, I had been through a few scenarios with traders where I realized that actually they're really crucial in this, and like cutting them out just is way too much risk and way too much basically risk and liability that I didn't feel comfortable for my clients or for myself at the time. And I would love to see where those roasters are today who are saying we want to cut out suppliers, because the best direct trade I've ever seen, like the gentleman you mentioned you were working with in Malaysia, there is direct trade facilitated by a significant and established and efficient trading partner, is the only way direct trade works. And
it's a
jump in. I know you want to.
No, it's a very loose word that I see, and when people say, "Oh, we've got this direct trade report, and we pay this much for our green coffee," and it's all, you need to read it and understand it. That there's a cost associated to everything, and it's even Starbucks uses companies like ours. They purchase, I think, like 8% of all the coffee in the world. Even a company like Luckin is asking importers for 10 minutes. It's because accessibility, finance, logistics support. We have great freight rates that you probably wouldn't be able to achieve based on sheer volume. So a lot of it is essentially, we do direct trade for many people, but it's essentially the service of, it's your coffee, but we are going to help get it from A to B. If you need a warehouse, there's a fee. If you need finance, there's a fee. And every aspect of it costs more money. The fastest way for any roaster to save money is to purchase coffee on an FOB basis, or what's called C&R basis, which is cost and freight, or CNF, sorry, or CIF, which is cost, insurance, and freight. We will bring it into the country for you. As it arrives, you have to get it palletized, etc., clear customs, and sent to your warehouse, and that'll save you thousands of dollars. but everyone, regardless of size, because you don't have a logistics team, you don't have the finance, you don't have the millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars to give away
Yeah.
at point of purchase. You know, if your payment terms are cash against documents, that whoever you're buying the coffee from is not going to release it until you pay it.
Yeah.
And then it has to go across the ocean. It'll take 60 to 90 days to get into Australia. And if it lands and it doesn't taste good, whose fault is that?
Yeah. I think it was reminding me during our conversation today, dude, a couple things of like experiences historically as a roaster where you'd ask for samples, then you'd just have them sitting there. You're like, oh, I'll get to them. I was like, those days are already gone. The days of like not knowing where your inventory up to is gone. The days of not knowing what you're going to need and thinking in harvest cycles is already gone. The reality of doing it is hitting a lot of people now, but it's already changed. It's that sense that I think there's going to have to be a lot more communication, a lot more forecasting, and a lot more trust in that supply relationship. Because the reality is, like, making those forecasts is going to have to work with the trusted individuals that you know that you can actually have them go, okay, I'm going to need a Brazil of this quality, of this amount, at this timeline. And you're not going to probably taste that for 6 months, but you need to be able to commit to it prior to that to know that that's coming in reality. And that's where I think is the biggest hurdle is this big shift that roasters are having. But I think it's just important that like communication, forecasting, and actual like understanding your supply chain and the dynamic of it and what you want to achieve in there. So like what am I trying to achieve? Am I in a position to discuss an FOB scenario with Dave or not? Or am I in a situation where I need to go, okay, can we sit down and talk about my holistic view? And I talk about holistic purchasing a lot. I don't need to talk to you about, I need Brazil now. Okay, what do you need this year? Where are we at? Okay, what are we looking at? And what are the timelines of requirements for those? Because when you communicate that with your supplier guys, that gives you the power to actually go, okay, so right now I can tell you you're going to be pretty close on Ethiopia because the amount you have is running out in February and we're not going to have Ethiopian landing till later in the year. So we need to plan for that and we need to have those things in place of how we can mitigate that. So that's, from my perspective, I think that's the biggest kind of 3 steps we can have with our roasters and our support. But yeah, is there anything to wrap up, dude? Is there anything lastly from your side that you'd love to impart on the roasters or give anyone just a bit of a heads up on best practices and ways that you can see them handling their green coffee in 2025?
Yeah, I think I mean you've summarized it fairly well, but it is that communication aspect. Like as an importer, a trader, exporter, you know, whatever, we don't necessarily know what's going on in your day-to-day business. And we try, we care. You know, I have some incredible relationships with some of the people I help, you know, get coffee for. But it's an understanding of when you need coffee. Please tell me when. People say, hey, what's your price of this coffee? It's like when you need it. That's
Yeah.
very important. It's that open communication, and also this might sound a bit silly, but you know, don't necessarily rely on just one partner. I tell many people it's very flattering when they want you to be their sole supplier. It's like at least keep an open dialogue with everyone else, because something might go wrong. And I have great relationships with a lot of the other coffee importers, and from time to time I might be like, oh. For example, we don't deal with coffees from Ecuador, as an
Yeah.
example. So I'll be like, actually, oh, I know these importers, they get coffees from Ecuador. Go talk to them. We don't deal with Robusta, but someone might be like, oh, actually, I need some Indian Robusta. It's like, oh, okay, maybe talk to these people. So it's having continuous dialogue, but also understanding, find your price point of what you need to operate your business effectively. Find your price point at which is your survival price point, because then that gives us an option to be like, okay, the market and price today is at this level. The Australian dollar has triggered this. Potentially, it's a good time for you to buy. I will never tell you when is a good time to buy because the market might change dynamically
Yeah.
overnight. The Australian dollar might go up, and then all of a sudden it's my fault. But it's like, is this at a value which your business can be sustainable? Because for me, to build an economically sustainable supply chain is imperative to our industry, because any cafe that closes, any roaster that closes, any importer, it's detrimental to the whole industry. So I don't want anyone to go out of business, let alone anyone in the coffee chain. So
Yeah.
open communication, understanding your pricing dynamics, forecasting and planning. Listen to people like yourself that are more of an open, honest feedback. It's one of those things that, and most of us, we're all pretty open when it comes to these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you nailed it there, man. It's just one of those spots of, it's about being honest with it. And like you said, it's super hard because you're, and the way you handled it, I think is kind of why you build trust with those relationships, bro. Because it's not about saying buy today. It's the best time to buy. It's like, hey, this is what it is. Does that financially work for you? But roasters get caught in the what if it gets better in the future. If you can afford it today, get it today.
Yes.
That's the catch right now, because it's no longer going to be like, if it goes down by 50 cents tomorrow, it could go, if it goes down by 15%, it could go up by 30% another day. We're seeing this volatility happen rapidly. Like we talked all coffee market. The biggest thing that's happened this week in just general markets is the release of the AI tool out of China. And you've seen the effect that has overnight on a market. These things can happen. We saw at the end of last year as coffee examples. We saw two different importers release two different reports about the same harvest out of Brazil that made the market go boom, boom in a day, like within the space of 2 days. So these things are out of your control. We can't control the wind, but we can set our sails and make sure you got your sails up to get through 2025 is my one piece of advice. Thanks heaps for your time, bro. It's been great to have you. I know I follow your Instagram, but I do not know your handle. What is your handle on Instagram? Because I highly recommend everyone going and following.
Well, I think it's no. I think it's David __ train.
Double underscore.
Double underscore. I think there was a surprisingly large amount of David trains on Instagram.
It's just a big
very interesting
guy called David who's into trains somewhere who got it before you.
Who knows? It's obviously a very interesting surname, but so just obviously people can reach out. I have a what do you call it, an Instagram channel where I
broadcast channel that's really good. Yeah.
I try to share. Obviously, I'm employed by someone, and I have my company's interests at heart, but I try to have a really open, honest information sharing platform in there. I won't put anything about what you should or shouldn't do. It's just, this is information that I've found that's relevant to the market. Please read.
Yeah. It's super it's super valuable. I am a frequent in Dave's channel, which is helping keep me informed, that I try and share with everyone in our audience as well. So I'll try and pop links into both those, because I'm sure I'll figure out how to do that at some point. But guys, if anyone's watching this and you have any questions, please feel free to pop them below. This is going to be on YouTube, Spotify, probably on Instagram somewhere as well. So do pop your questions below, because we want to have those conversations and we want to be able to address those. But if you are looking for anything, you can always reach out to Dave as well. Like, it is his job. It's not this is not a hard sell. We're just people who are dedicated to our industry and very passionate about sharing information. But if you need help, reach out. We're always there. Alrighty, team. So that's it from us today. Thank you so much for your time, David. It was awesome to talk to you. Everyone, be sure to follow, give us a share if you're interested in it. And if you need anything, you can always reach out to us. So happy roasting, team, and we'll talk to you all soon.